Hello, I'm Margaret Ryan with Clean Skies News. I'm speaking with Duncan Marsh. He's the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy. Duncan, thanks for coming here.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here.
You were in Bonn last week at the most recent meeting on the new climate treaty, and we heard some pretty negative comments at the end of that meeting from such as Ivo de Boer himself about the lack of movement there. What was your observation?
Well, I think it's a mixed review, actually. I think I did not have particularly high hopes of what this meeting could accomplish. It was essentially a process to get together and work on this text, this large 200-page negotiating text that the parties have before them, and make it a slightly more manageable body of work. And I think there was some progress made on that. On the other hand, the rate of progress is not nearly enough of what we need to see a Copenhagen treaty to put in place a new framework to move the world toward a low-carbon, sustainable path. And so there was a little bit of progress made, but there are a lot of big decisions out in front of the parties.
Did we see any initiatives from major countries, from the US, the EU, the BRIC countries?
I wouldn't say we saw major initiatives at this meeting. I think those are going to wait until next month, when there's a series of meetings at a very high level, many of them at heads of state level, in fact, at which they're going to be talking about climate change in a serious way. And so we're optimistic that those are going to send those signals from the leaders of these countries that can then inform the climate negotiators at the next round of meetings, who will be able to negotiate more constructively.
What are some of those meetings? What are the highlights for you there?
Well, they begin on September 16th and 17th with the Major Economies Forum, which is a meeting convened by the United States with 16 of the other largest economies in the world, getting together to talk about how they can cooperate on climate change and energy. Following that, the next week, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is going to convene a special meeting, day-long meeting, for heads of state from all 190 plus countries to get together and talk about solutions to climate change. This is in conjunction with the UN General Assembly, which will be meeting that week in New York. And then at the end of that week, there's going to be a meeting of the G20, which is a group of 20 largest economies in the world, whose finance ministers and heads of state will be meeting. And they're going to devote part of that session to talking about cooperation on climate change, specifically climate finance, to help the whole process in Copenhagen. So the signals from those meetings, what comes out of that, is going to be very key to understand what's possible to do in Copenhagen.
Well, now, we heard from several different sources that progress was made on what's called REDD, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. I know the Nature Conservancy has been very involved in that. How did that process go forward in Bonn?
Well, Margaret, you're right. We've been working on this issue of the issue of forest carbon, as it's known to many, that is reducing the rate of deforestation around the world, particularly in the tropics, and also reforesting, where we can, restoring natural forests. And it is a crucial part of these negotiations, actually. There are tropical forest countries who see opportunities for them and therefore sustainable development, and there's a need to control this very large source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's nearly 20% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions, and that's more than the transportation sector globally. So it's really important to address this. And fortunately, our feeling there is that the negotiations are going quite well on that subject. The negotiators on forest carbon actually felt that they were waiting for everybody else to catch up to the progress they made. We saw a lot of consolidation of the text. There was a very effective facilitator of that negotiation, and the countries are beginning to come together and find solutions to the different positions they've held for a long time.
What are the issues in REDD that need resolution?
Well, there's agreement on the fundamental carbon accounting methodologies, how you draw an appropriate baseline for what a country's emissions would be without intervention, and as a way of measuring what they can accomplish with intervention. And then beyond that, there's issues related to financing, how these will be financed, whether there'll be large government funds raised, whether they will have access to the carbon markets so that private investment can flow into this sector as well. And then beyond that, to dealing with things like the social issues involved. How do we deal with local communities and indigenous communities who populate the forested areas and who may or may not have clear tenure to the land which they occupy? And that raises the whole question of who owns the carbon rights on that forested land, and then who can transact those. So there are a number of complicated issues there, but there's also good ideas coming forth on how we can deal with them.
Are there other areas besides red where there's progress being made, or is that the big one?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are other areas. There are a number of pieces. Another key area regarding forests that I should mention is forests in developed countries, not just in the tropical countries, but in the developed countries. And there are rules under the Kyoto Protocol in place for most of the developed countries. The U.S. is not a party to that, but which apply to forests in most of the countries. However, those rules are somewhat inconsistent, and there's a fair number of what we consider actual loopholes where countries can exclude certain parts of their forests and land use activities from the accounting. We would like to see that tightened up and made more robust so that that entire sector of land use change in forestry is actually accounted for in countries' greenhouse gas totals.
Okay. Now, the financial mechanisms we're talking about here, do you anticipate that the G20 finance ministers will get down to that level of detail?
I think that they're going to make progress. I think there are two major aspects of it. One is the architecture of the financing system. Who will govern the financing, through what channels it will run, to what extent the private carbon markets can play a role and get credit for playing that role and for the investment that they would make against countries' national targets. And so that's a set of financing architectural questions or structural questions. The second question, and this is a big one, is how much money are the developed countries going to bring to the table to support adaptation and forest capacity building and adaptation and technology transfer to developing countries? And those are both open questions. I think it's really hard to meet the demands that developing countries are putting forth for the financing amounts.
We've heard numbers from the conference last week of $100 billion a year. I mean,
right.
That sounds like a big number.
It is a lot. I mean, clearly we need to see numbers getting up into that range when you combine both public and private financing through the carbon markets going forth. It's going to be difficult for governments to generate that level of funding for climate change in this economic era, but at the same time, it's very clear that the developed countries need to be prepared to bring things to the table in Copenhagen in order to receive the sorts of commitments to action that they want to see from developing countries. And this is something that's really important in our political process here in the U.S., is we have the Senate about to take on climate change legislation. As we know, the House already passed it in June. The Senate's now going to take it up, and it's really going to be important for the Senate to realize the connection between what they can do in terms of generating financing for developing countries and what other countries in turn will do to complement the U.S. efforts to address climate change.
Do you see, we always hear on Capitol Hill, China, China, China. Mm-hmm. Do you see China and the U.S. making progress on their bilateral negotiations here? My
sense is that they are, Margaret. I'm not deeply steeped in those details. I used to work on that when I was in the government, actually. But I think that both parties are approaching the whole discussion with a real positive attitude and recognizing they each have a special responsibility as the two largest emitters in the world. They're in different places with regard to their historical emissions level and also their economic capacity. China, despite all its recent growth, is not as wealthy as the United States and doesn't have the same sort of historical responsibilities. But it does recognize it does have a responsibility. It recognizes it's vulnerable to the threat of climate change. It's got water resources problems, the glacier melt in the Himalayas, which will exacerbate that, and on and on. So China realizes it's got a responsibility too, and it's trying to put in place a number of clean energy steps that it can do. So I think there's positive spirit on both sides. Whether there's time to actually get the bilateral agreement necessary to support a Copenhagen agreement, we don't know.
Okay. Well, Duncan Marsh, Director of International Climate Policy with the Nature Conservancy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Margaret. It was a pleasure.
I'm Margaret Ryan, Clean Skies News.